Hello everybody. Thank you for coming to the channel. I'm going to talk a little bit about a neuroscience topic. So this is about stroke. Stroke can have a huge effect on the brain. It can be hugely debilitating, and it's now kind of in the media. So I wanted to make a quick video about stroke and about ableism, frankly, which is something that when certain people, especially people with power or large media platforms, are biased and are very unfair towards those people who need, say, certain assistance. And I think that this is happening in a sort of very prominent way, and it's actually kind of shameful. So I wanted to talk about this video a little bit that the nightly news put out on NBC on John Fetterman, who is a Senate candidate. He is someone who recently had a stroke. It has affected his ability to speak in some ways, but really not that bad, as well as also some of his auditory processing. And I wanted to talk about it a little bit and what I think about the case, as well as like what's actually happened to him, and highlight some important points about this. So let's watch a little bit of this report.
Pivotal Senate race in Pennsylvania now considered a toss-up. Our Dasha Burns spoke with Democrat John Fetterman in his first in-person sit-down interview since he suffered a stroke. And Dasha, this was not a typical candidate interview.
No, Lester, because of his stroke, Fetterman's campaign required closed captioning technology for this interview to essentially read our questions as we ask them. And Lester, in small talk before the interview, without captioning, it wasn't clear he was understanding our conversation.
Right. I don't know why they're highlighting this. So he had a stroke, and it affected his auditory processing. So he's having a hard time hearing. So a stroke, for those that don't know, it's when you might have some kind of aneurysm or sort of break in the circulation in your brain. All of a sudden you will have a loss of the oxygenation and the nutrition that's needed to get to that part of the brain. Now, there can be recovery from stroke. In fact, that's often the case, especially with mild stroke. So it seems to me like Fetterman's stroke it's not like mini to the point where we don't see any symptoms, but it's also not nearly that severe either. So we'll talk a little bit about that.
Can voters trust that you will be able to do this job on day one?
Yeah, of course.
This is Pennsylvania Democratic.
So, okay, she said it wasn't clear that he could understand our conversation. Well, again, if he's having some trouble with auditory processing, and, especially if you're talking too quickly, or if you're not going to be sort of accommodating with someone who may need closed captioning, it's like someone who's deaf. So you sit there and you talk to them and they don't hear you. Well, that's because you're communicating in a way that they cannot possibly process. Fetterman's obviously not deaf, but if he's having trouble with auditory processing, he's not going to be able to understand what you're saying. If he needs to see it, then, well, that's what you have to do. That's what closed captioning is for.
Senate candidate John Fetterman's first in-person sit-down interview since a stroke sidelined him from the campaign trail for months.
That auditory processing where I'll hear someone speaking, but sometimes I'll be able to be precise on what exactly that they're saying. I use captioning.
His campaign required that he be allowed to use a transcription program.
So, something to see about this video. A few things that sort of stand out to me. All right, so this is probably a typical closed captioning device. It's listening to what the speaker is saying, and then it's writing out the text. First of all, it might not be perfect. You've seen what closed captioning can do on YouTube. It makes funny, weird sort of closed captions. Generally does a pretty decent job. This is probably not all that different. But the other thing I can see is that this text is super duper small. Probably big enough for him to read, but it is very small. And so obviously, like, his vision is not impaired whatsoever. I mean, that's just one thing that I'm just highlighting here. And there's a lot of text there. So he's reading a lot. Throughout this whole interview, I don't see any loss of comprehension, but let's just take a look.
Program on his computer during our interview.
I always thought I was pretty empathetic, emphatic. I think I was very, empathetic. That's an example of the stroke, empathetic.
Okay. So taking this thing out of context where he's struggling finding the one word, this can be an auditory processing thing. It could be a hint that he might have some damage in an area of the brain known as Broca's area. We'll talk about that in a sec.
I always thought I was very empathetic before having a stroke, but now after having that stroke, I really understand, much more kind of the challenges that Americans have day in and day out.
So you say you're on the road to full recovery.
Well, I feel like we have been very transparent in a lot of different ways. When our doctor has already given a letter saying that I'm able to serve and to be running.
I mean, respectfully, that letter from your physician, that was 6 months ago. Don't voters deserve to know your status now?
Being in front of thousands and thousands of people and having interviews and getting around all across Pennsylvania, that gives everybody and the voters decide, if they think that it's really the issue.
So, one thing I notice here, minor word drops. It seems like he may be struggling a little bit with tense, but everything seems totally comprehensible. You can understand what he's trying to say here. He's basically saying look, I gave a doctor's letter. I also, I'm out there campaigning now. I had a stroke 6 months ago. I am doing better. I'm out now campaigning. I had some time for recovery. I'm doing interviews now. I really don't see a whole lot of effect here.
Are you soft on crime?
Of course not. I'm actually effective on crime, and I believe in second chances, and I've run on that record.
Meanwhile, Fetterman going after Dr. Oz on abortion rights.
Dr. Oz likes to make fun of me that I might miss a word, but he's missed 2 words, and that is a yes or no on the national abortion ban. If you're going to be our next senator, you have to give the answer.
Lester Fetterman told us he is committed to debating Dr. Oz on October 25th, where he will also be using closed captioning.
I don't know. Highlighting the closed captioning part, making it seem as if this is something that's particularly exotic, is just downright shameful. Personally, I think that this is an example of some ableism on Dasha Byrne's part and NBC to be dabbling in this, to suggest that that there's something wrong with him as a candidate. There's something wrong with his cognitive abilities. It's as if someone who lost a limb and then they need to use a cane. That's really the extent of what closed captioning is. It's just taking the form of information that, talking, putting it into written words so that he can understand it. If he's having trouble with auditory processing, obviously he's not going to be able to hear the words that you're saying in the way that you're saying them. We have parts of our brain that are there just for auditory processing, and he may have damage in those areas. The other thing that I notice is that it looks like Fetterman has some words that are dropping off. There are several different brain areas that are involved in communication. We have, of course, auditory cortex. It suggests to me that sounds like that Fetterman may have had a little bit of damage here, because if he's depending upon closed captioning, that means he's probably having some trouble processing auditory information. But it could also mean that he has some damage in some other areas, such as in Broca's area. So Broca's area is very important for the articulation of speech. So another area that's also very important would be Wernicke's area, which is particularly important for the comprehension of speech, as well as language. So even written language will be compromised if you have damage in Wernicke's area. So this is the area right here. And then obviously we have the motor cortex, which is going to be very important for the production of language, because you got to control the muscles of the larynx, of the lungs, so they're coordinated so you can make sounds. To me, it sounds like he's perfectly fine in his production, except for the fact that he is having some trouble finding some words. And so why don't we talk a little bit about that, these different areas. This is a patient with Broca's aphasia. So this would be someone who has damage in the Broca's area. And what you're going to find is that this patient has good comprehension, can obviously understand questions that are be given to him, This patient likely doesn't have any damage in his auditory areas because he's not dependent upon closed captioning, but he's having trouble finding words. And you can see that Fetterman doesn't sound anything like this. So let's just take a look.
Can you tell us your name?
Mike Caputo.
And Mike, when was your stroke?
I was 7 years ago.
Okay.
And
what did you used to do?
Worked Autodesk, seven sales, and worldwide, and very good. Yeah.
Okay. And who are you looking at over there when you turn your head?
That's my wife.
Okay. And why is she helping you to talk?
She's a speech.
So you have trouble with your speech?
Yeah.
And what's that called?
Aphasia.
All right. And so why don't you work now?
I do.
And what do you do now?
Voices of Hope, aphasia.
And what is Voices of Hope?
Peterburg, and Dr. Hinckley, and myself, founder for me, and I members the members, probably 60 people.
So 60 people are part of Voices of Hope,
Yes.
which is an aphasia support group
Yes.
that you founded.
Yes.
And Dr. Jackie Hinckley is part of that.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so that's a great example of aphasia. Broca's aphasia. So clearly he's having a speech issue. He can understand everything that's being said to him. He probably does not have deficits in his auditory cortex, but he's having trouble finding the right word. And it's pretty severe in his case. Like, he's having really severe trouble finding almost all of his words. He couldn't even come up with the word 60. He had to do 60. But his comprehension is intact. He's able to communicate an idea, and the listener, even though his speech is really pretty broken apart, we can totally understand the point that he's trying to get across. Just being patient and understanding that he's fine. So he's not a stupid person. Obviously, still has all of his comprehension. He started an organization, Voices of Hope. I'm going to link to this video right here. So we'll put up a little link here, and a little panel that'll show up so that you can look at this video yourself. Important work that this person is doing. Had a severe stroke, but he's able to still talk. So aphasia is when you have trouble speaking. It sounds to me like Fetterman has some really minor aphasia, that sometimes he's having trouble finding the right word, such as when he was trying to come up with the word empathetic, and he came up with emphatic, right? So, but that's totally fine. That's really actually quite normal post-stroke. It also sort of suggests that he has maybe damage on his left side of his brain, because the left side of the brain has a lot of these core language areas that are really important for finding words and for grammar, as well as the comprehension side. And then the right side of the brain, super interestingly, there are language centers on the right side of the brain, but it has to do with what we refer to as prosody. So the emphasis and the intonation in our language is regulated on the right side of the brain. And to me, it sounds like Fetterman has all of that, right? He's able to express emotion in what he's talking about. In that interview, he was talking about how Oz, needs to to come out with his position on abortion, right? So let's look at what it would be, what a severe aphasia case would look like if comprehension was severely affected. So that's going to be in the next slide. And so we're going to look at that. This is referred to as Wernicke's aphasia. So in this case, we know that individuals will have damage in Wernicke's area, which is a very different area of the brain. They will sound like they know what they're saying. They'll sound like they have good speech abilities, and that they can string words together in a way that is comprehensible. But if you listen to the words, it sounds like word salad. So this is sometimes referred to as fluent aphasia, because superficially it sounds like they're able to just talk and talk normally, but the words that they're saying make no sense whatsoever. They also, because they have a deficit in their way they process language, they're unable to follow commands. And that's obviously not the case with Fetterman, so let's just take a look. This is by the same group.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get
will
to
store it
Juneau.
right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
The iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I change for me and change hands for me. With happening.
I'm going to do this over. Okay, there you have it. You can see a different kind of aphasia, fluent aphasia, where this person, clearly was able to sort of string words together, not really struggling to find words, but none of the words made any sense. Like, it didn't make any sense whatsoever. She asked specific questions. He was unable to string together a sentence that had any sort of semblance to the thing that she asked. And it's clearly, that would be an issue if there was that kind of effect that we were seeing in Fetterman, but we don't see any hint of that whatsoever. Clearly what he's struggling with is some of the sensory processing part, which is why it would need the closed captioning, as well as the fact that he might have a tiny little bit of the word identification portions, so that he's always struggling with finding the right word. That's not a big deal. I mean, obviously he can still do everything that he needs to do. And I think it's sad that the media is trying to make it look like this is some sort of exotic condition. And, I think that there's a lot of stigma that comes with stroke. A lot of people feel embarrassed. They feel like that they're failing in some way. They shouldn't feel embarrassed. It's no different than if someone lost circulation to their foot and their foot had to be cut off, and then we're going to accommodate those people. But it's just easier to see because you can see their foot has been cut off and they don't have a foot. It's not really all that different. And it's a shame. It's a shame. NBC should feel awful about the way they portrayed that as something that was like strange and exotic. And I think it's okay to highlight it, but it could have been a way for them to take the stigma away for patients who struggle with stroke. And they didn't. They did the opposite. They should feel ashamed. It's obvious that he's perfectly fine in his overall comprehension. And honestly, his speech is mostly fine. It wasn't anything like that other guy at all. So, I don't know. I feel bad. But I did think that it was somewhat instructive in that we can, have some sympathy for people who suffer from neurodegenerative disorders and injuries to the brain like stroke. And that we should be accommodating for those the way that they have to deal with it. And it's, NBC should feel ashamed. So I'm going to end there. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of content, I'm going to put out more of this. I'm going to touch on things when neuroscience comes up in the media. And I am, I'm also just going to talk about some interesting neuroscience results that get popped up that are being published. There's tons of great neuroscience that's happening. So, yeah, if you'd like this content, feel free to subscribe, and we'll check you next time. Thanks.